Good morning to all of you, and thank you for joining us today in the press conference center in Geneva, but also online and live. Clearly, a few weeks before Paris, the ability for everybody to understand where are we at the moment in terms of a level of ambition that is now emerging in terms of particularly the INDCs that have been submitted by over 150 countries from around the world. Where are we also in trying to understand what is Paris likely to be able to offer the world in terms of accelerated action, and how does it in terms of what we have done now for the sixth time, trying to relate the level of effort collectively and individually by countries and nations and economies to the trajectories and the science that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has given us through its successive reports, and relate this also to the options for further action. I also want to mention that our work in terms of the emissions gap report is one that we conduct in very close coordination and alignment also with the Secretariat of the Framework Convention. As many of you are aware, the UNFCCC released its initial analysis a few days ago, and you will find in the presentation from our chief scientist, Achim Steiner, in a moment also an explanation of how these two reports align to each other and how they speak to a different set of indicators, but from an analysis of a common body of evidence. Let me also say that the emissions gap report is not simply a UNEP analysis alongside many other analyses. We set out in 2010 in producing this emissions gap report because it is an attempt to try and draw on the collective capacity of analysis of models that are being used in different institutions that are looking at both the projected actions that are now on the table, either following Cancun or now with a view also to Paris and the implementation of the INDCs. The report this year is developed and also worked through with contributions from 37 lead experts representing 23 research groups around the world, located in 15 countries. So it is an attempt to try and take the full spectrum of analysis and information and different models and try and bring them together so that both the public, the negotiators, and the parties to the convention have the best possible and up-to-date analysis available. Now, as many of you, particularly also in the media, in trying to convey the complexity of this information and also dealing with many of the assumptions that still underlie future action on climate change, will find there are many different ways of telling this story. Achim Steiner in a moment will speak to the evidence and the empirical foundation of what we are presenting to you today. What I would like to offer to you is a framing of these findings at this particular and very historic moment in time. My first observation that I want to share with you, and I do so unreservedly, I think we have seen in the run-up to Paris a historic breakthrough. That historic breakthrough is, simply put, the fact that we now have a commitment that you can soon describe as universal action to address the challenge of global warming and of climate change. More than 150 countries have now submitted their INDCs, their national climate change strategies, in the context of the process of the UNFCCC. This is unprecedented, and it marks a significant departure from where we were just a year or two ago. These INDCs cover close to 90% of the world's emissions, and therefore this is no longer marginal, this is material. This in fact covers the vast majority of the emissions footprint as we know it today and as it is projected into the future. This is critical because it means the convention is continuing to catalyze, even if at sometimes a slower pace than many of us would wish, than the science is dictating, and that many believe the opportunities would also suggest a pace of action that allows us to look into the future with a sense of enhanced opportunity and confidence that there is a capacity to act collectively, internationally, while very much taking into account national conditions and capacities to act. As you will also hear from our distinguished representative from Morocco, INDCs are not simply documents that are produced in a small chamber or government department. Many of these INDCs represent national conversations, deep consultations across different sectors of the economy, with leaders from civil society and also business in order to determine what are possible trajectories that individual nations can take forward to also concentrate national strategic discussions about energy, about infrastructure in such a way that virtually every country on the planet will have a proactive approach to addressing the challenge of climate change within the broader setting of a collective international effort. Let me also say that while I am giving you a strong sense of a very positive momentum leading up to Paris, clearly my intention, nor that of all the experts involved in the emissions gap report, is to talk up the state of play. But I do think it is important for the world to understand that what we are, in a sense, addressing this morning is not simply a status quo scenario. We are beginning to bend the curve, but as you will hear in a moment from the more detailed analysis, yes, it is not yet enough. It is probably halfway towards what we do need to achieve on a longer term trajectory, which we in UNEP, based on the work of the IPCC, still refer to as a net zero emissions future somewhere in the second half of this century. The years, obviously depending on many assumptions, are probably somewhere between 2060 and 2075, when the world will have to reach a point where zero net emissions is the indicator with which we need to judge the response of our global economy and of the many national economies and settings in maintaining a pathway that is compatible with the 2-degree scenario. Therefore, what we are also drawing as, in a sense, a very obvious conclusion from this analysis is that in Paris, there is a need to build into the future work of the convention and therefore of every party to it a dynamic approach to continuing to enhance and scale up ambition at regular intervals, which would allow us to both believe and with some credibility assume that there is potential to still maintain that pathway towards a zero net emissions global economy in the second half of the century. Now, some of you will perhaps ask the question, is this realistic? Is this even justified in terms of past evidence? Without taking more time, let me point you towards just one example, which is the renewable energy economy that we have seen literally explode in the global setting over the last 15 to 20 years. This is an example that all the projections and scenarios that were put out 20 years ago, 15 years ago, completely underestimated the potential and then factual increase in renewable energy technology deployment across the globe. UNEP's analysis for 2014 documented that close to 50% of all new electricity generating infrastructure installed in 2014 was actually renewable, and that is excluding large hydro. We are talking here principally about wind, solar and geothermal. This would have been considered impossible 20 years ago and even by many experts unlikely 10 years ago. It is just one illustration that the potential for scaling up for greater and enhanced ambition is not theoretical. And as the report also will point out, because we analyze a number of those opportunities, they are plentiful, but they will require continued concentration by countries individually and by the global community collectively to send the right policy signals, to put the enabling environments in place, to allow technologies to be deployed, new land use and management systems to be put in place, etc. But this, I emphasize, is not a theoretical scenario. It is a hypothesis that is in part validated already by having witnessed how quickly our global economy has been able, and in many country contexts, willing to move forward at a far greater pace than many had anticipated. With these introductory remarks, let me now hand back to you in Geneva. Thank you.